Had a chance this weekend to go over some of my previous modeling. I've found really, even though the data is kind of old now, nothing has been changed or nothing has been presented that would refute the fact that I do believe the DCVax-L GBM trial will show positive results. So a lot has happened. You know that the plan is per the company to have the top line by the end of June, early July. Data lock has occurred at the end here of May. So I wanted to go through some of my old modeling, and I know a lot of others have done very good modeling. Pretty much all of the people who have done modeling have modeled and have shown positive results for this trial. I would include the Leprechaun, who is a very, very smart modeler. So when I reviewed my very first model, before we go into the actual model, we really have to look at what is current standard of care. And really the current standard of care right now in this country is the Stupp trial from the early 2000s. So just to give you a little background information, when you look at the Stupp trial, one has to look at the characteristics that were included in that trial. So this is a list from the New England Journal article showing the characteristics. The control arm of the trial was radiation therapy alone, which had been the previous standard of care for a number of years, or radiotherapy plus temozolomide here. Now, the thing I want to point out with this is that fully 16 and 17% here of patients had biopsy only in this trial. And that is essentially zero for the DC Vax trial. And we do know surgery is one of the prognostic factors, or extent of surgery. So you kind of have to keep that in mind when you're reviewing. It's one of the reasons why you can't just directly compare the Stupp data with DC Vax data. So that's an important part to review. Then they have a wide variety of other characteristics. They even had 4% that had anaplastic astrocytomas and 1% that had inconclusive pathology. So when you go look at the Stupp data, this just gives you a background of what we have to beat and what the current standard of care is. So this is the probability of overall survival and months in survival here. And you can see there was a statistically significant improvement with a hazard ratio of 0.63, which essentially means 37% less death in this case in the patients who got radiotherapy plus temozolomide, and that was overall survival. Now they also did one for progression-free survival, and again, the hazard ratio again showed a significant result favoring the temozolomide. This formed the basis of the temozolomide, in addition to radiation being the standard of care. And so the hazard ratio here was noted down here and was 0.54, meaning approximately 46% less progression in this case for patients who had the temozolomide. So you go up here and you look at the results, which are over here noted, and maybe we can zoom in on that a little bit. It really wasn't a huge amount of time. Overall median survival went from 12.1 to 14.6 months. Progression-free survival median went from 5 to 6.9. So we're talking only 1.9 or less than 2 months improvement, and yet this became the standard of care. So it wasn't, like a touchdown pass, but it was an incremental improvement. So when I look at the DC Vax trial, I couldn't really use this data set to compare because it really didn't have the same entry requirements as the DC Vax. So the control patients in the DC Vax trial should relapse at a rate similar to what was shown in the IMUC trial. Now, why do I say that? The IMUC trial was a trial which was published in the 2014 ASCO, and it had very similar entry requirements to the DC Vax-L GBM trial in terms of eligibility criteria. So the progression-free survival was reported at the ASCO in 2014, so one can then take that progression-free and overall survival curve, and that essentially gives you the data to put into a statistical program so that you're able to get a control curve. So the big assumption here for this model is that the control patients of the DCVax-L trial will relapse at a rate similar to what was shown in the IMUC trial. And that's a reasonable assumption. However, that is an assumption. And that's the main assumption that this model is based on. So that's the one thing you have to assume. Otherwise, you don't have enough data. So you look at the IMUC data here. This is what was published at ASCO in 2014. This was overall survival. And you can see there was really not a big difference between. Now, I should say the IMUC data only had, I think it was up to 6 antigens. So very limited antigens compared to DCVax, which has unlimited antigens that they perform the lysate procedure on. But really underwhelming here. But one can take the control population curve and use that curve to formulate your model in terms of the control. So we know the control had 43 patients and 28 events, and with the median survival noted here at 16.7. This is overall survival. They also did the exact same thing for progression-free survival, and actually the antibody treatment was actually a little better. In this trial, I think overall survival was the primary endpoint. However, so the trial was considered a failure. Progression-free survival was not the primary endpoint, I believe. So one can use the control data here to input and put into your model, because this curve gives you the parameters necessary. So you have to assume that the DCVax trial control population, which was 1/3, I believe, of all the cases, will relapse progression-free in a similar way that was shown in this trial. So once you have that data, then you, in order to compare the IMUC trial with the current DCVax-L trial, control patients, one, you have to add 83 days because of the starting points were different between the two trials. The IMUC data was upon the first administration of immunotherapy, whereas the DCVax was right after surgery. So every major trial uses surgery as the day 0. At any rate, you have to account for that when you're doing this analysis, otherwise your numbers will be off. So my second hypothesis was, given that we know the number of events that were given to us in the DCX trial at the first interim analysis was 66, and this was actually published in a Northwest Bio press release. Okay, so that brings us to our second hypothesis for this model, and that is that the company has given us some data points along the way. The first data point is listed right here, and in December 2013, the first interim analysis of the trial before it was expanded was completed, and we were actually given that there were 66 events, progression-free events in this trial. And here's the data. This actually I took right off of the Northwest Bio page where they have all their press releases, and this was the actual press release. And you look down in here, it does say at the time of this interim analysis of the Northwest Bio phase 3 trial, 66 such events comprising 60% of 110 events required to reach the primary endpoint of the phase 3 trial had occurred. So this was a very important number, and we'll utilize this number for our model. The second piece of data that the company has given us in one of their press releases occurred on February 2017, and they reported 248 progression-free events on or before the date of 2/1/17. Now this was with the expanded trial, and it also said in this press release that the overall survival numbers had not yet been reached in terms of number of events required. So these were two very important pieces of information that we then have to input into our model in order to try to show that what the DC Vax trial is going to look like. So what you do is you input the data from the control arm of the IMUC curve into modeling software. I used JMP SAS software in order to determine Kaplan-Meier curves. So you input this in and you create a Kaplan-Meier curve that is equal to the IMUC control arm curve. And the only thing that's different is you use the numbers, the number for the DC Vax. And okay, so then one can take these important numbers, the control IMUC data, as well as the 66 PFS events and the 248 PFS events which were given by the company. One can then model a curve using the DCVax-L numbers of patients to determine, using Kaplan-Meier plots, how many events will it take for the DCVax number of patients to have a curve exactly the same as the control curve. So that will give you your control population. And when you do that, you note that it will require 100 events for your DC Vax control arm to look like an exact replica of the IMUC data. So armed with that information, you're able to take then the total number of events, which was reported as 248 by the Northwest Bio press release, and you get the following: 248 minus the 100 events, this should be 100 events, equals 148 events in the experimental arm, which is really what you're after. So now that you have the derived 148 events of the experimental arm, you can model the experimental arm to be exactly the same as the IMUC control arm. And I like this because this gives a element of being conservative, because this says that the DC Vax doesn't have any effect. So you're modeling it based on the control arm, but is the key point, you only allow 148 events when you're modeling it. So that's all the events you can use, because that's what we derived through this mathematical formula here. So when you do that, you're able to then see what is the difference between the experimental arm, which is the DC Vax arm, and the control arm, which did not have the DC Vax. Now I like this one because it's PFS, which is the primary endpoint for the trial, but also this will not then have any confounding effects from crossover, because the event is progression. And so patients didn't really have crossover until progression occurred. So crossover occurs after this. So when you do this and put in this data into the Kaplan-Meier plot, the results come as follows here. And so one can see you get a fairly wide divergence of the two curves in terms of progression-free survival. Now, I was only able to model out to about 35 months because we just didn't have any data, and we still don't. This trial actually has 2 more years of good follow-up way out here, and it's one of the reasons why it's taken so long is the company really wants to see what has happened with this tail here, this plateau, which we have never seen in glioblastoma at all, a plateauing of the progression-free survival curve, which is pretty exciting. This was a statistically significant, a highly significant result with a p-value noted here. I have published a number of these models on the iHub message board. They're all listed here. My first one was 3433 way back in 2013. I've listed the numbers here because it'll go into more detail. If someone wanted to go back and look at them, it would give you some more detail on the rationale of this model. At any rate, when you come and you see this, it's kind of sobering, because as a physician who works with patients with this disease, this is unbelievable. And it almost is awe-inspiring. And I do believe that this will be very similar to the results we are going to see when top line is announced. And this will be earth-shattering in terms of this disease. Let's remember that glioblastoma multiforme, it's not just a cancer. This is the emperor of all cancers. This is the cancer that is the worst. I can count on one hand how many long-term survivors I've seen with this cancer, GBM. It is the emperor of all cancers. And so we have never seen a plateauing of the curve. So if we see this with the DC Vax, it's going to be an earth-shattering result. People will demand this therapy, and rightly so. So in synopsis, my best educated hypothesis is clearly the DC Vax-L is going to return a positive result, I believe, on the primary endpoint, which is progression-free survival. I think it will also be on the secondary endpoint of overall survival. And it may even show subset analysis that are positive as well. The thing that's going to be very interesting with this trial is I don't think we have any trial that has as much follow-up as we have with this trial. Even the Optune data, you look at that, they don't have a lot of follow-up. This trial, we are going to actually have real follow-up data. We're not going to be relying on censored data where the N goes down to very few patients are forming this part of the curve. We're going to actually have follow-up. So that's going to be very powerful. It's my opinion that this result will be practice-changing and immediate, especially when we see the plateau in the treatment curve. I like the idea of the PFS not showing any crossover effect between the curves. Crossover effect can occur with overall survival because, as we know, pretty much all of the people who progressed did get DC Vax after they had their progression. So just to put this into perspective, the Stupp GBM trial only increased by 2 months, less than 2 months in progression-free survival, and it became the new gold standard, a multi-billion-dollar drug. I believe the DC Vax increases this in operable patients even more than the chemo did, with very limited side effects, and quickly will be the new standard of care. So I'm going on the record prior to top line, and I wanted to go on the record prior to top line so that then when top line occurs, we can see if the alpha here was correct or not. So good luck to you, but I wanted to get this info out prior to top line. Thank you very much.